Good afternoon. It's a privilege to welcome you to our annual Brian Beck lecture. This lecture, established with the support of his widow Margaret, honors Brian's legacy, and we are pleased to have Margaret and Julia with us today. The Reverend Dr. Brian Beck, former student and principal at Wesley House, served as both president and general secretary of the Methodist Conference. Brian was also an important figure in the development of the Oxford Institute for Methodist Studies. As a minister and theological educator, he insisted that Wesleyan scholarship should transcend the horizons of our founder, John Wesley. This conviction shaped his important contribution to world Methodism. He emphasized that Methodist identity is formed not only by Wesley's theology and ministry, but by the lived realities of Methodists from around the world. Today, the ministry of Wesley House continues to build on Brian's legacy. Our work with Methodist scholars from around the world embraces wisdom and insights from a plethora of different contexts. Our global reach extends from the Gambia to South Africa, from Europe to Canada, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia. In each of these contexts, we encourage our students to allow their lived realities to shape both their theology and ministry. Today, it's a great pleasure to introduce the Reverend Professor Dion Forster, Professor of Public Theology and Ethics at the Vrije University in Amsterdam, and a Research Fellow of Stellenbosch University and Wesley House. Brian Beck described Wesleyan theology as a synthesis of evangelism, social care, and the struggle for justice. In his lecture today, Professor Forster asks how perfecting love might inhabit the public square as an expression of Wesleyan social ethics for a fractured world. In the spirit of scripture and conference embodied by Brian Beck, the lecture considers the promises and perils of diverse and sometimes divergent Methodisms shaped by migration and contextual and global entanglements. Professor Forster will help us reflect together on how Methodists from across the world can draw on their heritage to serve the common good. We welcome you as Forster.
Well, goedemiddag, good afternoon, as we would say in South Africa in isiZulu, sawubona. You have been seen, you have been seen. Friends, it's a wonderful privilege to be able to share in this afternoon, and Mrs. Beck, thank you for the opportunity to do this, and to the dear colleagues of Wesley House, Cambridge, the trustees, staff, students, alumni, members of the community. I'm very, very grateful to be able to share some insights with you. It was moving to meet Mrs. Beck in worship at Wesley House, at Wesley Church on Sunday, where she was doing the intercessory prayers. And afterwards we spoke about the fact that once you're a lay preacher in the Methodist Church, you never get away from being used in some way. Now, what I would like to do in this Brian Beck lecture today is reflect a little bit on an aspect of Reverend Dr. Beck's theology and weave that into thinking about the resources that we have as Methodists for public life. I first encountered Brian in 2002 during a visit to Wesley House, Cambridge, and then later in that same year at the Oxford Institute for Methodist Theological Studies. Brian was recognized as a significant figure in world Methodism, and one of those names, you know, the names that we tend to look up to in our training. And as a young Methodist minister, it might be hard to believe that I can be younger than I am now, but I was younger then. I also came to know Brian as an attentive and very kind and committed elder in the Methodist Church. He took a particular interest in young scholars, such as myself, and perhaps because of his and Margaret's time in Kenya, he was particularly interested in the ministries and lives of African Methodists. Now, this lecture is not an exercise in remembrance as such. I don't think I'm qualified to be able to do that well, but I do want to see how some aspects of Brian's theological instincts and commitment can be woven in relation to this theme. What I wish to reflect on is a distinctly Methodist conviction, namely that perfecting love can be understood as a public vocation. Now, if those words, perfecting love, don't mean too much to you yet, don't worry. You'll hear them often enough so that eventually you'll ask me to stop saying them. Now, this is a theological orientation that Brian embodied in his scholarship, his pastoral ministry, his leadership within the church. And I think it's a fitting lens through which to consider the contemporary task of public witness from a Wesleyan theological perspective. So let me just say something about that at the start. What I'm presenting is not the solution to public problems today, but simply trying to say that as Wesleyan Christians, Methodists, we do, I think, have one particular thing that we might offer as a contribution to the world today. Now, by way of introduction, I want to attend to the core concept that will frame the whole of this lecture. So if you forget everything else, this is probably the one thing to try and remember. And just to warn you, there are some buzz questions afterwards, so do try to pay attention. I've been told if you don't get the answers right, I do the lecture again. Now, the question that I would like to ask and try to answer in the lecture today is this. If you, as a Methodist, or as a person working alongside Methodists would think about it, what particular or specific contribution do you think our theology and tradition might offer to public life? In one of his final pastoral letters, written only a year before his death, John Wesley described what he called the grand depositum entrusted to the people called Methodists. And that term was Christian perfection. And he specified in that pastoral letter the purpose for which he believed we had been given this particular emphasis. Listen to this. He says that Christian perfection was given to the people of Methodists, and here I quote from Wesley, for the sake of the world. Now, many of us are familiar with the phrase Christian perfection, and some of us even with the doctrinal emphases that come from that. But I wonder how many of us have actually paused sufficiently over the horizon in which Wesley situates this concept. As we'll see in today's lecture, Wesley did not imagine perfection as a kind of mystical withdrawal from the world, not primarily as the moral refinement of the church or the individual believer. Rather, for Wesley, Christian perfection names a particular vocation. I would even suggest a public vocation. It is holiness expressed as love perfected by grace, directed outwards towards the neighbor, the society, and in contemporary terms, towards the flourishing of all creation, both human and non-human creation alike. As Daniel so beautifully captured it in his introduction today, Brian had this instinct in his work, and it was a joy to be able to read many of his books and articles in preparation for today. In his 2017 book, Methodist Heritage and Identity, he observes that to be what he calls Wesley-like means that we come from a tradition that has learned to combine what often appear to be incompatibilities. And the incompatibilities that Wesley-like people combine are evangelism, social care, and the struggle for justice. Now, this succinct formulation names a theological imagination in which belief and embodiment, proclamation and responsibility are held together rather than placing them in tension. Wesleyan Christianity is concerned not only with what the gospel sounds like, but also with the quality of the gospel-shaped life. Wesleyan Christianity asks what a gospel community looks like, what it feels like to live in a good news community. Now, I know at least one person in this room, Martin, who will know what I'm talking about, but this Sunday, the 17th, I think it was on the 17th was Sunday, there was a very special celebration in Methodist Central Hall, Westminster. Do any of you know what it was? It was the 80th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations, an institution which is currently under threat, a global institution, which had its very first meeting in that building, held by Methodists. Now, this kind of focus should not be a surprise to us. Wesleyans and Methodists, more broadly, have long understood salvation in a deeply liberative and restorative sense. Christian perfection names a vision of grace that does not retreat from the world, but moves deliberately towards it. A vision whose horizon includes social, economic, political, and ecological consequences. Now, Wesley, we know, employed other phrases or near equivalents for Christian perfection, each illuminating a slightly different dimension of what he meant. The first of those is perfect love. In the Wesleyan tradition, love is not only an interior sentiment or a private moral disposition. Love, rather, is a transformative political force that presses outward, seeking to shape relationships, institutions, and social practices. Perfecting love is, in this sense, a social virtue. Another term that Wesley used is scriptural holiness, which signals a form of life that is ordered by grace, informing both personal character and the patterns of our communal living. Simply stated, if perfection means love perfected by grace, then holiness of heart and life carries with it civic obligations, and it should generate from within us a kind of social imagination for healing, transformation, and flourishing. The deeper God's love transforms persons and communities, the more it overflows into concrete practices of neighborly love and the pursuit of the common good. Wesley's vision of holiness of heart and life, another very well-known Wesleyan phrase, this resonates with both spiritual depth and public consequence. And this Wesleyan inheritance has shaped a globally diverse family of communities. And what's interesting is that this content has remained remarkably portable. As Randy Maddox comments, a heart renewed by love will seek the renewal of its social world in justice and compassion. Born in the revivals of 18th century England and refined in contexts such as Cambridge, Pietermaritzburg, Kuala Lumpur, even Amsterdam, God forbid, this vision continues to offer a compelling theological resource for a world that is marked by persistent crises. And indeed, we do live in a time that is marked by converging and mutually reinforcing crisis. So just to say two things, there will be a published version of this lecture eventually in Holiness, I hope. And in there, I unpack 4 crises that we deal with. But for the sake of your sanity and our time, I'm not going to deal with those today, although we will touch on them. Now, the point that I wanted to make in this first section is, to put it simply, perfect love, love brought to fullness by God's grace, has the capacity to sustain a faithful public witness of hope and healing in the midst of crisis. So the crises that I discuss are things like the fracture of democratic institutions, migration and the ethical concern for hospitality, violence and the threat of war, and of course the ecological crisis. And my organizing conviction is this: salvation understood in a Wesleyan key, salvation is healing issues in both personal and social holiness. So let's spend just a couple of minutes doing a little bit of theology. This is the bit you've all been waiting for, am I right? Good. So I want us to talk just for a moment about Wesleyan soteriology. So the Wesleyan way of looking at the doctrine of salvation. Now, within Wesley's order of salvation, God's grace is directed not only towards the pardoning of sin, but towards the healing of sin as a condition that distorts human life and relationships. And the intention of this is to restore persons and communities and creation to wholeness in Christ. Now, what's interesting about the Wesleys, and those of you who study Wesleyan theology will know that John and Charles became quite enamored by a new version of the Eastern Fathers, the theologies of the Eastern Fathers, that was published when they were students at Oxford. And so this left an incredibly deep impression upon the way in which they thought about salvation at that time. I've written about this. There's an article on the 250th anniversary of Christian perfection where I unpack the subtleties of this. But today we're going to touch just on one central element. And that is that for Wesley, theology is seen not just as a juridic concept, grace that releases us from the guilt of sin, but more expressly, salvation is seen in this Eastern Orthodox way as a form of theosis. Persons are restored, they are healed, they take on through becoming holy the image of God. Therefore, as I've argued elsewhere, salvation is not only a state of spiritual rightness with God, in other words, being set free from your sins, it's also a process of public rightness before God and with all persons and creation. Reconciliation with God, therefore, is never an end in itself, but draws believers into reconciled relationships with others and the wider created order. Now, this is the thing that I think is absolutely new, and I hope others will pick up on this. From what I can see so far in public theologies, so the ways in which people conceive of the liberative intent of Christianity in public life, most of them are dealing with justification. So this primary view of dealing with sin and its evil. I think Wesleyans are the first ones who can make a contribution in terms of sanctification. What does it mean to grow after liberation into a kind of rightness and holiness before God? Now, where does this conviction stem from? It stems from a classic expression in Wesley's insistence that there is no holiness but social holiness. And for those who know that phrase well, don't worry, I am going to unpack it and situate it properly. But what it does introduce to us is the notion that for Wesley, holiness is inherently relational. It's formed and tested in the texture of our shared life. As Wesley in 1739, so think about how early this was in Wesley's ministry, he said there is no such thing as personal holiness, or holy solitaries, as he puts it. And I quote him, he says, "It is a contradiction in terms. The gospel of Christ knows no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness." Now, to be made perfect in love is therefore to be drawn more deeply into the love of neighbor. Sanctification, Christian perfection in Wesleyan theology, carries within it an irreducibly social dynamic. As Wesley indicated, his understanding of salvation is therapeutic in character. And this, I would venture, places him at some distance from the Lutheran and Reformed traditions that have tended to emphasize the more judicial or juridical accounts of sin and salvation, such as those that are associated with theories of penal atonement. That's the egghead bit. If you remember that in the exam, you'll pass. Now, Wesley described sin not only in terms of guilt, but more expressly as a disease that disfigures human life. and as grace not merely as pardon, but as healing directed towards restored holiness. Now, in this respect, Wesley was significantly shaped, as I mentioned, by his encounter with orthodox soteriology. The Eastern Fathers articulate salvation in terms of theosis. God becomes like us through the incarnation in Jesus Christ, so that in relationship with the God-man Jesus, we might become more like God. And salvation in this way concerns the restoration of humanity's capacity to love God and neighbor rightly. Now, the telos of salvation, the end point of salvation in this kind of soteriology, is what Wesley describes as holy love. Love that reshapes not only the affections of a person's heart, but renews the will and reorientates human life towards God and others. And I think in this instance, we encounter one of the defining features of the Methodist theological imagination, the unique contribution that we can offer to public witness in these times. And that is that there is no real separation between doctrine and ethics in Wesleyan theology. If you want to read a really brilliant chapter on this, I'd recommend to you Stanley Hauerwass's chapter in his book, Learning to Speak Christian. It's called On Wesleyan Theological Ethics. And there he basically makes the argument that he is not a professor of ethics, but just a professor of theology who takes his beliefs seriously. Now, in this light, Wesley's often cited, and we're going to return to this now, holy solitaries must be understood in a very particular way. Okay, this relationship between doctrine and ethics, the inseparability between what we believe and how we act. So in the preface to hymns and sacred poems, this was the only time that Wesley uses this phrase, social holiness, which has become so well known. He gives a classic expression to the conviction, frequently misquoted and sometimes misunderstood. So let me read for you again just the whole quote. The gospel of Christ knows no religion but social, no holiness but social holiness. Now, for Wesley, social holiness does not negate personal piety. But what it does do is that it completes it. Holiness is formed, tested, and made credible within the shared practices of community and the demands of living our lives with others. And it's important to note that Wesley did not understand social holiness as being synonymous with social justice in the modern sense of the word. This category simply didn't exist in Wesley's vocabulary or linguistic framework. Rather, we know that what Wesley intended by social holiness was that the psalms and hymns that are contained in this hymn book should not only be sung in the privacy of your home or your room, but if you really want to test them, sing them in the presence of others who can see whether you really believe what you are declaring to be true about God. So this relationship in Wesley's theology illustrates the tension between doctrine and ethics, between piety and responsibility, between private and public faith. Now, let me just say one thing. What I'm advocating for is not a form of social activism, which is often detached from spiritual formation. What I am claiming is that holiness, living rightly before God, is inherently relational and therefore unavoidably public in its implications. Now, here comes the New Testament bit. Both Dr. Beck and I are New Testament scholars. The etymology or roots of the term holy are instructive here. And I went to go and have a look at the sort of semantic range of the use of the word holiness during the time that Wesley wrote in 1739. We can see that it derives from the Old English word heilig, which traces back to a Proto-Germanic word heiliger, which carries connotations of wholeness, of soundness, and of being uncontaminated or uninjured. Can you see that when Wesley speaks of holiness, what he's speaking about is what it may take for me to become whole and live in such a way that wholeness is enacted in society. That, I think, is one of the unique things that sanctification offers to public life. So viewed through this lens, public theology can be understood, listen to this, as sanctification that speaks and acts with love in the public sphere. Not power, not coercion, not ego, but love. Okay, let's calm down a little bit from this deep theological treatise and say a little something about public theology. I am a public theologian. If I don't do this, I don't get my salary at the end of the month. Now, by way of clarification, there seems to be some consensus emerging amongst public theologians, and I tend to differentiate in my work between public theology with a small p, where public is an adjective that describes the way in which theology operates in public life. All theology is public. You can't believe something and think, well, you know, if I think that God is the creator of all earth, that it stays at the end of my door or only in my service. All theology is public. But not all theology is public theology. That's important to recognize. Now, the public theologians, and here I use public theology as a noun, capital P, capital T, have some consensus about the characteristic of what constitutes this particular discipline, this approach to thinking theologically about public life. This is also in the test. 6 characteristics. Let's see if I can share them intelligibly and meaningfully. So most of this work has been done in the journal, International Journal for Public Theology, and through surveys of the various characteristics which are explained, these 6 have emerged. Now, let me just say, these are what I would call minimalist characteristics. Of course, there are many more. People like Matthew Kamink, for example, has a reformed public theology set. I have Catholic colleagues who are doing Catholic public theologies, Muslim colleagues, Jewish colleagues. So all of this is coming through, but these seem to be the kind of minimalist set for something to be public theology. Okay, first of all, public theology is theology. It's not political science. It's not social psychology. It's not economics. It is theology. And if you are a Wesleyan Methodist Christian, then public theology must have some kind of a theological biblical profile. It needs to be recognizable as something that draws upon the tradition from which we come. Secondly, public theology is multilingual, often seeking to translate between the differing accounts of meaning and reality, such as those that are found in the sciences, other sciences, in other religious traditions, in other identities, in other cultures and other geographical locations. The work of the public theologian is often to be a kind of interlocutor, a bridge builder between the voices of the medical practitioner and the clergy. We once ran a conference on women's reproductive rights. I can tell you, if we didn't have doctors in that conference, it might have been theologically interesting, but absolutely useless. Can you see that? But sometimes we also need theologians to sit, for example, in places where, I often do this I serve on the expert network of the World Economic Forum. I'm there to challenge economists when they say, well, the limits of what we can do are dictated by what is economically possible and profitable. And then I say, well, that means your God is mammon, because that's the extent of the possibility of your imagination. So the role of the theologian is often to translate between these contexts. So number 1, it's theology. Number 2, it's multilingual. Number 3, public theology is therefore often interdisciplinary in character. Can you hear Wesley here, who was shocking people when they were unwell, who was thinking about all sorts of treatments? And can you hear someone there who's thinking, what might it mean to move beyond the traditional sources of Christian reasoning, the Bible, the tradition of the church, and adding to that these important sources, what Albert Outler regrettably coined as the Wesleyan quadrilateral. By the way, Daniel published a wonderful article on this just recently, 2022. But this notion of adding to scripture and tradition the concepts of reasoning and experience. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that queer theologians, feminist theologians, black theologians find Wesleyan and Methodist theologies so enticing, so interesting, because we take experience very seriously. So it's often interdisciplinary in nature, frequently working alongside, between, and across disciplines. Okay, fourthly, public theology strives to be competent to offer a political orientation. Now, this is very important, I think, for us to recognize, particularly for Wesleyans and Methodists, as I said earlier. If we believe that human persons are created in the image of God, if we believe that to be true, the consequence of that is that we should be able to say, with some measure of conviction, a society that operates in this way is more faithful than one that operates in that way. So that's what we mean by a kind of political direction. Not pronouncing on all sorts of political claims or joining political parties, but being capable of making a qualitative theological contribution to the structuring of our individual and political lives. Okay, fifth, can you remember the first four? Theological, multilingual, interdisciplinary, political orientation. Fifthly, public theology often has a prophetic character. Now, by prophetic character, what we mean is that it is coherent in some ways with the prophetic tradition that we find in the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, where the prophets would come to the king, the priest, the judge, to the nation even, and say, if you continue to live in this way, it will not go well with you. If you continue to oppress the poor, abuse the earth's resources, if you continue to misrecognize and under-recognize and abuse one another, it will not go well with you. So the public theologian is often trying to take very seriously what it means to listen for the voice of God in contemporary society. By the way, I think that's one of the things that makes this kind of training so important. Here we do rigorous, incredibly important theology, but within a worshiping community. We take seriously that the God about whom we're thinking and speaking is alive. And that God still speaks. Sixthly, the final characteristic that we can see in contemporary public theology is that it is often intercontextual in nature. You'll be glad to know there's only one point after this, then we conclude. I'll warn you to return your chairs to the upright position in a moment. Okay, the sixth characteristic of public theology is that it is very often intercontextual in nature. Now, what do we mean by intercontextuality? Well, we mean two things. Of course, the public theologian should be astute enough to be able to differentiate between Lagos and Lisbon, and the ways in which people will make sense of their concerns and needs in these different contexts. So those kind of geographical, social, cultural contexts, obviously. But there is one other way in which public theology functions. And that is that the public theologian often has to deal with the tension between the universal claims of Christianity and the very particular way in which those claims are enacted in different times in history and different places. For the last 15 years, I've been working on the politics of forgiveness between black and white South Africans. One of the questions for me was, isn't it time to give up on forgiveness? White South Africans have so disabused the concept of forgiveness. Shouldn't we just say this concept has become poisonous, it drives us apart? And the answer is no. We cannot give up on forgiveness. You cannot be Christian and not deal with forgiveness. But if you were to say to a black South African, just forgive your white counterpart, I think that kind of forgiveness is untrue. It's a heresy. So in this particular context between the universal and the particular, there are a whole number of political requirements that have to do with land transformation, economic reparation, with social and emotional healing, so that forgiveness in its fullest and truest and most Christian form can possibly take place. So this is often the role of the public theologian. Let's quickly run through them again. Public theology is theological, it's multilingual, it's interdisciplinary, it offers a political direction, it's prophetic in character, and it's intercontextual in nature. Now, this concept of the Wesleyan quadrilateral, this posture of doing theology, where scripture remains primary, where reason and tradition and experience cultivate an openness towards interdisciplinarity and open engagement. And Wesley himself, I think, modeled such attentiveness through his sustained interest in fields such as medicine, natural philosophy, what today we might call science, economics, and political thought. And all of this is grounded upon one little conviction that you'll find in Wesley's work. 1781, Wesley famously said, "All truth is God's truth." Not everything is true, but where you encounter truth, it is the revelation of God. And in this light, the core of a Wesleyan public theology can be stated with deliberate simplicity. It is grace that heals, holiness that takes social form, and love that becomes public. Friends, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. Let's give him another round of applause. So we'll now have a time of Q&A. We've got one from the chat. Do you want to read it out, Mida?
Carol Long says, noticing the UK's fragmented social trust, the impact of Brexit divisions, social media algorithm bubbles, awareness of deepfakes, Wesley's influence would suggest we need public tech policy that rejects, quote, absolute thinking, unquote, because we need moral ground and recognition for the individual and community, not side-taking or specific modes that are unconsciously biased.
Carol, thanks for that question. So, yeah, in the longer paper, that was actually the issue that I decided to focus on, was the erosion of democratic institutions and the loss of public trust. Now, I would think that there are two things that are important for us to recognize. So the one thing is the Wesleyan orientation pushes back against the cynical emptying of the Christian faith. And I think this is what I often see. I mean, our real expert is someone like Jonathan, who understands these things. But what I see happening very often in the use of Christianity in particular in Europe is that it becomes, rather than a religious tradition, which is filled meaningfully with concepts such as justice and mercy, compassion, grace, it gets emptied and becomes a kind of social marker. If you are a Christian, you belong to the in-group. If you are not Christian, in other words, most often Muslim, then you belong to the out-group. The other thing which I think I see happening in Europe, certainly in the Netherlands, is that Christianity gets attached very much to what is called a kind of Christian Occident, a European Christian Occident, which is often a dog whistle for whiteness. It's racism. That's what it is. It's not Christianity. And, you know, the Wesley that I encounter, I think would name that, would say, well, you know, that is not perfect love. That is something else. That is something that seeks to other, to dehumanize. Now, of course, I'm using very contemporary language, but my sense is that this is one of the things that we as Wesleyan Methodists can offer, because we have this view that is so deeply relational, that is so deeply found on our relationship with others. So I think, you know, one of the things, for example, in the paper, I mentioned one example of this. There is a document called the joint initiative on public something here in the UK. The joint issues on public issues, the joint initiative on public issues. That for me is a wonderful example of a kind of theological engagement that leans into these difficult issues, that doesn't shy away from the fact that there are strongly held divergent opinions, but that does it with a measure of faithful discernment. My sense would be that, part of what we also need to revive is the sense that our social activism emanates from a deep spirituality. So just like we can't separate personal piety from social holiness, we also can't separate social holiness from personal piety. My own work, for example, which is often described as activism, is actually just me trying to be a faithful Christian. So some of that I think we can reintegrate into our churches as one way of dealing with these kinds of fractures.
Thank you very much. Any questions in the room? Yes, Pauline, let me come over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dion. I just wanted to get your thoughts about, you mentioned in the 6 principles or aspects of public theology, you talked about this ideal of forgiveness, and you gave that example from your own work. You mentioned forgiveness, but you didn't talk about repentance. So would you like to say something like that within the context of public theology?
Yes, absolutely. So this is a topic I could talk about a lot. So thanks for giving me that opportunity. Okay, let me say one little thing about that, which is a slightly, that's been my project for a number of years. So when I was looking at this notion of forgiveness in South Africa, one of the things that I recognized was that these calls for forgiveness among South Africans were actually leading to deeper divisions. And part of what we saw, and I did qualitative empirical research with groups on this, and part of what we saw in these groups was that there were some radically different understandings of forgiveness. I'll just say it in 2 sentences. Amongst predominantly white South African westernized Christians, forgiveness was seen as individual and spiritual. Who is the offended party when you sin? It's God, wherever God is. So what do? You confess to God, apartheid was wrong, I'm sorry for my part in it, please forgive me, I won't do it again, now let's leave it. And that's why you hear young white people saying, I had nothing to do with apartheid, can we just let it go? For black South Africans, where social identity is primarily collective, and the injury against God is also an injury against people, there were inherent political requirements. To just give you an idea of this sort of social primary location, remember one of our students, when Ralph and I were at the seminary together, I asked him, how are you? And he said, no, doc, my mother was sick, but now she is better. And my eldest sister gave birth to a healthy boy. And my younger brother was unemployed for a year, but now he's working. I am well. You can see that the place of identity begins out there and works its way in. And so black South Africans in that project were saying, there's no way that I can pretend to forgive you, Dion, while you control the economy, you live on stolen land, and you're not repenting of these things. So I think, that's part of the reason why in that project we refused to divorce forgiveness from its political consequences. We actually worked a little bit with people in Ireland. They suggested that the word that they use is mercy in the Troubles. And we said, no, we can't use that because it doesn't have that contingent element to it. Forgiveness requires recognition of wrongdoing and repentance. So I think, public theology requires us to do some of that hard work. If we didn't rely, for example, in an interdisciplinary way on the social sciences, if we didn't think about, for example, social identity complexity theories, the ways in which white westernized people, black African people form their identities, if we didn't think about issues like economics and land, we wouldn't come to this thick theological description. And I think public theology gives us an opportunity to do that.
Thank you for your helpful lecture. I've just been wondering, when it comes to articulating what we believe, what Wesley believed, I don't think there's too much of a problem, because it's quite good to have the conversation and think through it. But the dissonance between what we believe and what we articulate as we believe and what actually happens, how do we bridge that gap? And especially as we think about globalization and immigration, and all of the stuff that we're having to respond to today, social media being in there. How do we do that in a way that is liberative, but also healing?
Yeah, thank you. Your name?
Charity.
Charity. Thanks, Charity. That's a really important question. So Stanley Hauerwas, who's also a sort of Methodist theologian, says that, one of the things he encounters today is that when there is a gap between what we believe and how we live, we often try to change what we believe. And I think that that's somewhat true for how we live. And my sense is, so let me just say one thing here. And by the way, Daniel, you captured it beautifully in the introduction. This was one of the remarkable things that struck me in reading Brian Beck's work. So Brian was honest about the fact that Wesley and Methodism is a tradition of promise, but it also had some problems. That we can't pretend, for example, that Wesleyan theology or Wesleyanism is without some sticking points. I mean, Wesley was a man of his time. The ways in which he thought theologically are there. What I do think I learnt from reading Brian and also from reading Wesley is that there is this incredible emphasis on saying we have to take responsibility for seeking after the truth. We have to do that. And when we discover something to be true, we have to work incredibly hard to figure out how do we enact that truth so that we can be faithful to God. So we can't believe things and not enact them in our social relations or in life. And I think one of the things that I think we are invited to do as Wesleyan Christians with a public witness is to think quite carefully, what does it mean to sanctify institutions? So for example, what might a sanctified immigration policy look like? I mean, if we were to think about an immigration policy that deals with people migrating in terms of perfect love, what might that look like? It might be quite counterintuitive to what political scientists or economists might be telling us. It might not even have the kind of longevity to always work in this way. But what does it mean to act with perfect love in that situation? What might a healthcare system look like that is enacted with perfect love? So this is part of what I think at the very core of this paper I was trying to get across. Sanctification is the one element in public witness and public theology that I think has been underexplored. And we have an opportunity to make a contribution there.
I have another question from the chat from Oscar, who says, has two questions. Start with the first one. Thank you very much, Dion. How do you distinguish, in a Wesleyan framework, between legitimate public theological engagement and forms of political activism that risk undermining ecclesial unity within Methodist congregations?
Often when I'm teaching my students about public theology, one of the first myths I have to bust is that public theology is only constructive or good. I mean, Donald Trump is a pretty public theologian. I mean, he's making all sorts of pronouncements about who God loves and what it means to be faithful to God. He knows how to hold the Bible upside down. So all of these kinds of things, in a sense, are a form of witnessing to a kind of faith in public life. I think one of the things that public theology requires of us is to have a kind of a critical regard for the ways in which faith is enacted in public life. And this, I think, Oscar, gives me an opportunity to say something that's very important. I think I hinted at it at the beginning of the paper, but just to say, if we only had a Wesleyan public theology, I think we would be in trouble. We need our Muslim sisters and brothers. We need our secular humanist siblings. We need our Jewish colleagues, particularly if we think today about conflicts such as the genocide in Gaza. These are not things that just a Wesleyan can resolve. So we are having to think what it means to take very seriously the passage that we read in worship. I think it was on Tuesday or Wednesday night from Wesley's sermon. If your heart is right with my heart, then give me your hand. You know, what does it mean to figure out how we can join hands for the sake of the public good? And sometimes that does mean that we have to engage, in a sense, in an ethics of love that includes some compromise. In just over a week's time, I'll have been married for 32 years to Megan. It's a loving relationship, but yes, we have had to learn to sustain that relationship. Takes some compromise at times. That's what love requires. So I think that's what perfecting love requires of Wesleyans. Archbishop Tutu, I'll always remember, would say to us, you know, before I can be a good ecumenist, I first have to be a good Anglican. People need to know who I am and where I stand. And I think there's something there. We do need to be good Methodists, try to be the best Methodists we can be, but then we need to be Christian. And then we need to be human.
Thank you. It kind of follows a tiny bit on that, because we found it an interesting conversation because neither of us are Methodists. And so the aspect of what you're saying is there something particularly as a Methodist or Wesleyan contribution? And we discussed a range of things, but perhaps to pick up a couple of them, that in one of the contexts we talked about, holiness would be thought of as very personal, but that wouldn't mean that that particular church wasn't engaged with evangelism, social care and struggle for justice.
Yes.
And from a different perspective, we were thinking about the Church of England and the parish system, where whatever social might mean, the geographical, political aspect of the way that that particular denomination is configured has an effect on how these things play out.
Yeah.
So just really, I don't know if you've got any comment on either of those, but we weren't sure how much of it was distinctively Wesleyan.
Yeah. Yeah, and this raises a very important point. So how much of that is distinctively Wesleyan? Of course, there are many of these things which we share with other groups. Daniel and I were just talking during the break. Of course, he's a Newmaniac, John Henry Newman scholar. And of course, many of the things that Wesley has are actually Anglican in a sense. And of course, as I tried to point out, they come from the Orthodox traditions. So Wesley himself, as we know, Reck very famously argued, you know, that what Wesley was a reasonable enthusiast. He was quite excited by ideas and would lean into them, figure out how to be very pragmatic in achieving what he thought the gospel aim was. And then from there, he would try to think theologically about how that fits in. Now, I have a sense that that may be both a strength and a weakness within a church. And that, I think, is where we need some siblings to hold us accountable to our own identity. This was one of the interesting things for me. And I mean, maybe you knew this. Maybe it was just me who didn't know this. But when I went and read that introduction to sacred hymns and psalms, and I saw the context within which Wesley spoke about holiness, that it was really this sort of thing about saying, you know, you can't be holy just by doing this privately. And I think today we would probably speak about ecumenically, in an interfaith way. I think certainly for those of us who come from parts of the majority world, I think we would also say we have to pay attention to our siblings from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, who are making sense of the world in different ways. So that kind of, and this, by the way, is one of the gifts which unfortunately I didn't bring into even the typed article. It was part of the abstract. You know, an abstract never quite turns out in the final article. But one of the things I think either I or someone else should do a bit of research on is Brian Beck's notion of holy conferencing. So for Methodists, that's a very particular word. What does it mean annually to gather and to conference, to deeply debate, to hold one another accountable, even to have robust disagreements around issues of doctrine and ethics and practice. So I think there's something there that we can offer, but of course we can't do that on our own. This context, of course, the context of the lecture had a particular purpose, but I would love to hear my colleague Rudolf von Sinner, speak from a Lutheran perspective, Matthew Kaming from a Reformed perspective, so Serene Jones, so hearing these people speak in different ways.
Dion, just following on from what you're saying there and Zoe's question, wonder if this discourse is more important for Methodists than it is for others to hear. In a sense, it's our internal dialogue to connect what we believe with what we do and to understand our own linguistic framework for that, so that other traditions might get to the connection between personal piety and social activism by different routes. But our route needs to be through social holiness. And that may not mean we have something different to offer in terms of a particular critique or a particular prophetic word, although I do think for me the lecture's rehabilitated Christian perfection a little bit for that purpose, and I think that's potentially fruitful. And to know whether it's fruitful for anyone else other than for Methodists to think about it better would be the proof would be in the pudding, I guess, of working the examples.
Yeah. So Jane, thanks for that. I agree wholeheartedly. In some senses, that is part of my plea. So let me say two things about the internal dialogue. I think that that as a church that operates around the world, we need to cultivate a new imagination for robust love for one another that, as Peter Story would describe it, nails ourselves to the other at the cross. That's painful, because there are many people in our denomination around the world who believe things that I think are frightening. And they probably look at me and say, Dion, how on earth? So part of what I would appeal for is that kind of, to enliven an imagination, a capacity for that. One of the places where I think that can happen is amongst academics, scholars. It's definitely not the best place to happen, but we have tools, we have opportunities, societies, conferences. We very often know each other, we can place each other to some extent, and I think we need to take that a little more seriously. But there is something else that strikes me about this. And here I have to place myself, even though I'm a Zimbabwean born, South African raised, working in Amsterdam, I am westernized, individualized. And for me, one of the richest journeys has been to learn from Methodisms that are making sense of the world in very, very different ways. Some of you may remember the lecture I gave at the Oxford Institute in 2018 on Christian perfection and African Christian humanism. So the ways in which Southern African Methodists like Nelson Mandela, Robert Sobukwe, adopted this deep concern for anthropology. What does it mean to be human? If we believe in the God-man, what does it mean to be fully human? So I think that we can also learn from people who are thinking in other ways. Our Malaysian siblings, who will greet us by saying, "Have you eaten yet?" in the morning. So I think there are ways in which we can enliven that. One of the challenges, of course, is, one of the challenges is, of course, that the weight of international Methodist scholarship is held in places where people like me teach. The good news is Wesley House breaks that mold. You model for us what I think an international community of scholars from around the world who do their contextual work seriously looks like. And I am proud to be associated with the house, and I hope others will learn from this.
Can I build on that a little bit? Because I'm probably the least disciplined person in the room in terms of theological background. I did do a theology degree, but that was so many decades ago, it makes it irrelevant. But I'm sitting here and I'm listening to what is really powerful and fascinating stuff and really thought-provoking. But this is an academic environment, and you've made a brilliant reference to the quality of the work that Wesley House does. But how do we find language that translates that into something that's meaningful, that the likes of me can take into the places where I work and live that in reality and describe it in reality?
Yeah. Okay, so that's a really brilliant question. So I'm going to give you the sort of public theology academic answer for this. So there are two things to say. The one thing I think that is a gift about this approach to thinking theologically is that it is not a discipline. Public theology is not a discipline like biblical studies, practical theology, church history, systematic theology. So that's in the theological academic sense. Those disciplines exist. You have public theologians who read the scriptures, public theologians who study history, for examples. So public theology operates in a sense a little bit like, for example, we might say feminist theology, contextual theology, theologies of liberation, in that way. What public theology takes seriously, however, is it asks the question, what does this theological reasoning mean and contribute to public life? So that's the telos, that's the intention of why we use this particular approach. It's not the solution to everything, but it is one very important contemporary approach to theological sense making. Now, if I just think about the PhD students who've been here this week and the kind of work they're doing, Ralph and his work on poverty alleviation and policy within the church. Brad, who's working on depression and what it means to journey with people who are depressed. Doris over there, who's writing about spiritual warfare in Pentecostal African churches and how, that can express forms of othering. And so these kinds of things, I think, do incredibly important research. The question is, of course, once we have the thesis, what do we do with that? And I think certainly in public theology, our thing would be to say, if all you're going to do with that dissertation is get a CV item and another book on the shelf, then we failed in our work as public theologians. So what can we do with that? Now, let me say one last thing about this. Not every scholar has the capacity to do that well. I'm not great at that. But it does mean it doesn't absolve me of the responsibility of working with teams that can help to take some of the ideas that I've got and turn them into something that's useful for the congregation, for the ordinary member. In my case particularly, a lot of the work that I do gets translated into policy. We've just had a massive project with the European Union around the limits of religious freedom. I mean, what do you do in Germany where you hold religious freedom, but religion is being used as a weapon to exclude and damage people? So that kind of work, people like me will sit and we'll think and we'll speak to politicians and we'll speak to religious communities, we'll gather the data, but we do need policy wonks, who can come and help us to translate that into something else. But if it doesn't happen, I think I've failed.
So another question from Oscar. Regarding holding together evangelism, social care, and justice in a Wesleyan public theology, in Methodist contexts where churches are already overstretched, financially and emotionally, how would you discern which of these dimensions to prioritize without collapsing the integrative vision itself?
Yes. So, Oscar, that's a brilliant question. And it does allow me to say, please go and get a copy of Brian Beck's wonderful book, Methodist Identity and Heritage. It is well worth reading. It was published in 2017, and there's a chapter that deals with this tension, specifically for Methodists. Now, I'm not a missiologist and not a practical theologian, but my sense would be, as a systematic theologian who loves the Bible, I am guessing that congregations, societies, churches might have charisms just like people do. Each congregation might be gifted in some way in this time to do certain things well. It might be because of the pastoral team that serves. It might be because of lay members. It might be because of where they are located. In Amsterdam, for example, I serve as part of a team that works primarily with migrants, with what the government calls undocumented migrants. We think they're migrants. And part of the charism of that church is to be able to get alongside people. I find I'm doing a lot of things there that I used to do in the late 1980s as part of the anti-apartheid struggle. Because I'm white, I speak Dutch, I'm companioning people to the municipality to ask, why did you turn this person away? Can you explain it to me? These are their rights. I spend my Saturdays helping people to write their CVs so that they can get jobs, translating things. Now that's the particular charism of that church. My son attends an international church once a month because it's in English and he doesn't speak much Dutch. And they have a great contemporary worship team and it's full of young people. So my sense is one of the things that I think we might need to have the maturity to recognize is not every church can do everything. But again, just like with me, I don't think it absolves us from partnering with those who do other things well. I think we do have to think about that a little bit and pray for those who are in leadership and responsibility to have the wisdom to help us to structure it in that way.
Right. Thank you, Dion. As the comment about holiness, no holiness, but social holiness comes from the offering of hymnody, and I know we are moving into worship not too long from now, and let me ask a liturgical theologian's question. As a public theologian, what might you offer as advice to those creating a worship environment that best helps form a social holiness that leads in worship, which is where Wesley starts that conversation about social holiness, into a perfecting love that can be embodied in public theology?
Wow, that's a great question to end on. What is your name?
Tom.
Tom? Okay, let's see if we can land this plane. I think that's a great place to bring it to a close. So I've thought a lot about this. So the good news is there are some wonderful examples of people who are working in this space. There is one Reformed person and one Methodist that I'll mention in particular. Probably the most important person who's working in the area of liturgy and public theology is a guy called Jamie Smith. And he wrote this series of 3 books, a trilogy of books, Desiring the Kingdom, Imagining the Kingdom, and Awaiting the King. And these are what he calls a liturgy for public life. And part of what Jamie Smith says is, what we do on Sunday matters for Monday. And what happens on Monday should shape what we're doing on Sunday. Our Monday life should shape our Sunday worship. And he uses this notion of liturgy. We know that liturgia means the work of the people. So he says very often what we're encountering in societies like the one in which I live, a highly secular society, is that people are engaged in what we might call a non-religious religion or a secular religion. They have a liturgy. If I think about it, what is my liturgy daily? I wake up in the morning. I normally make a cup of coffee. I am still one of those persons who does daily devotions. I read the scriptures. I pray. For some of you, I place a cross over my neck, which I wear every day. I think about the day. I have no difficult staff members, so it's, never a problem, no difficult students. And then I go into the day asking that God gives me grace to do that. But my neighbor, who's Dutch, who is a 3rd generation unchurched, unreligious person, they also have a liturgy. And their liturgy might be different. And how does it form them for living an encounter? It might be, this is an absolute caricature, I don't know, but they might wake up under pressure, rush to get the kids ready, race to catch the train before they miss it, get into a conflicted workspace. The first musical instrument they play is their email keyboard, So people are living these liturgies, and that's what Jamie Smith says we need to think about. The Methodist who's done probably, I think, the most important work on this is a guy called John van der Laar. If you go to sacredize.org or sacredize.com, he has resources. He wrote a book, a wonderful book. It's called The Hour That Changes Everything. And basically what he's doing is he's thinking about how we form the life of the community so that people remain church even when they are not in the Sunday service. I mean, the question he's asking is, what does it mean to remain in worship, to declare the worth of God, even when I'm not in the pew, when I'm in a difficult business meeting, when I'm having to performance manage someone who's underperforming? What does it mean to remain in the worth of God and the God whose ways are worthy? So I think that's something to think about. I think we need new hymns. By the way, the other person who's done, I think, some of the best work on this is, and I mentioned him earlier as well, is a guy called Matthew Kamink. He's now at the Theological University of Utrecht. He was at Fuller, and he wrote a beautiful book called Liturgy and Labour. It has some of the most beautiful liturgies in it. One of the liturgies I remember is a liturgy that he developed with people who were pickers in California. So undocumented workers crossing the border to come and pick fruit in California, and how they bring the fruits of their labor to the altar. It's amazing. On Spotify, by the way, they have an album of worship music. It's called Worship for Workers. Well worth listening to. Inspiring. Okay, no more from me. I've spoken too much.
Dion, thank you so much. I mean, you can tell by the questions and the conversation in the room, the thoughts you stimulated, that you've made an impression. And I think people are beginning to see how there might be clues as to how to kind of take this forward and make it practical. Thank you for connecting our spiritualities with our public responsibilities, particularly for those of us who are Methodist Christians. Thank you for helping us locate John Wesley as a public theologian, even matching 6 criteria. Thank you for expanding and centering the concept of perfect love, such that we can have confidence to call out false Christianities and engage public issues in our own contexts. You and I first met some 25 years ago in Pretoria, when we were both kind of pretty early on in our journeys as scholars, and around the time that you first met Brian, and also I first met Brian. At the start of the lecture, you named Brian as a global Methodist to whom we were all looking up. And today we thank you for the scholarship and the discipleship of the last 25 years that mean that we now are looking up to you, and are very grateful for all that is underneath what you showed us today. And as you've engaged questions, I think everybody has heard the depth and breadth of your scholarship and your integrity. And we're very grateful that you shared that with us today, that you will share it with us in print in the Holiness Journal. And while we are here, also very grateful to you for being with our students and our other visiting scholars all week, and just sharing as one of the group in that enterprise. And thank you for what you'll do tomorrow in a private masterclass, I'm afraid, for our members of our study intensive. So as ever, we're very grateful to be associated with you, and thank you so much.
Thank you.